I'm Wendy Buckley and I'm the chair of the Sustainable Business Network in North Hampshire and also client director at Carbon Footprint. This is the recording from the Sustainable Business Network event on climate change target setting that was done on the 8th of January. It's very topical, and as we move into 2021 and all that will be, it's an ideal time to start looking at your businesses and setting what are realistic and practical steps to target climate change. The session was done whilst we were in lockdown 3.0 and hence the home working situation that we all found ourselves in at the time. I hope you enjoy the session.
It is a very topical subject today, and I'm delighted to have a full range of speakers on the session today. And let's just run through who they are. You'll still see the QR code on the screen for a couple of more shots there if you haven't had a chance to deal with that yet. We have three speakers, all returning to the SBN, and I'm delighted to welcome back Professor Ian Williams from the University of Southampton, Joel Fernandez from Carbon Footprint, and Sharon from Portals as the case study today. We'll start then with the usual updates on legislation and market, and it falls to me to do that. Well, what's been happening? We have these two gentlemen at the top here waving their fists for various reasons, and these are President-elect Joe Biden and Boris Johnson. We have high hopes that Biden will be re-entering the Paris Agreement and will be committing to some net zero carbon targets very shortly. As for Boris, we have COP26 coming up, delayed obviously last year, but that is going to be happening in November this year. The other two folks on the screen, we have John Buckley in his homework location. I think John is the managing director of Carbon Footprint, and like so many of us, has been homeworking now for quite some time. The lovely lady on the right there is Margaret Keenan. She is the first lady, of course, the first person in the UK to receive the Pfizer vaccination, which should be the way out of the situation we find ourselves in. If you can just do a quick reminder here, if you have got your video on or your mic, can you please switch them off right now for bandwidth? We're just seeing someone on the screen there. Let's move on. We talked about homework. Let's think about this again. This was one of the key subjects, obviously, of the last SBN meeting. There is a link at the end of this session. If you missed that session, there's an excellent presentation there by Joel Fernandez that's running through that. The things to remember are that even though you might think your office is using less energy, some of the facts are that the lights are still on there, the heating's on, and for many places, still a lot of energy is being used. On top of this, with so many of us in the home locations, and particularly in the UK, because we have very lossy housing stock, there is a footprint associated with this. This means for many organisations now, the annual measurement of the footprint includes that home worker contribution. We have to talk about Brexit and the, well, good-ish news, I guess, on Christmas Eve, was it? Is that Boris Johnson did secure a deal with EU. Now, it's not for me to go through the, 2,000 pages or so of that document, and frankly, I haven't been through it yet. But we're going to pick out a couple of things here related to the environment, which I hope will help. It looks as though there is some reliance on both the EU and the UK keeping to their commitments in terms of net zero. And the implications there, if we don't, being that some kind of tariffs might come into play. So that continues to be important. We know that the European Court of Justice is not going to be playing a part in what we do now, and that was all part of what Mr. Johnson was trying to negotiate. There is still a lot of concerns, certainly from the SBN here, of who's actually going to be watching what we do. Who is the watchdog for the UK? And with so much going on at the moment, there seems to be very little information on how that's going to take shape. So watch this space and we'll keep you advised on what's happening there. COP26 is coming, and we do have some new targets. Those have been revised, and I think we can all see the numbers up here. So we now have this interim target that's gone up, as you can see on screen. And if I'm being a bit churlish here, I'd say, well, our target's greater than the EU is right now. It's going to be fantastic to see how we actually reach that target. So we'll be watching Mr. Johnson very carefully there to see how that all pans out and what we achieve with that. Obviously, the ultimate goal here is the net zero carbon by 2050. Generally speaking, these results were received with mixed response from the media and the industry, who would like us to go faster and harder to particularly supporting jobs post-pandemic. The Committee on Climate Change published its 6th report, which was a little bit of a mixed bag. I think we're going to see this come through in commentary on some of the presentations. So my part here is just to draw your attention that this was in the news. I guess the good bits are there in terms of decarbonisation of the national grid. We're going well there. Also, the CCC revised the amount of GDP that it would actually take to achieve this. It's now sitting below 1% of our GDP, which I think is a positive thing. The downside to this is that we don't appear to be on target to meet these goals right now. And a couple of the bugbears there relate to the electrification of transport and into agriculture. And there's been a few issues in the media you've seen around that, around livestock and farming just this week. The other issue, and this goes all the way back to the homework footprint, is the residential side. The housing stock is still very, very lossy, and we need to improve on that. So still quite a bit to be done. There's a lovely graph, and from this, I'm not going to explain this. We don't have time. So this is a bit of homework to have a look at this, please, in your own spare time there. What we have are the graphs. Hopefully you can see my cursor on screen here, tracing how we get down to net zero, okay, by that time scale. However, BEIS, excuse me, the government department, excuse me, is now forecasting that this somewhat drops off along this blue line, following the policies and the strategies that we have in place at the moment. So work needs to be done to drive this right down here. We always report on some of the fines for transgressions in these sessions, and there really isn't a great deal that's actually taken place. But I will highlight this one for a particular individual called John Bruce, who's been labelled as a career criminal by the EA. As far as we can see, this guy is pretty much a sole trader who has done some other environmental transgressions in the past. So as you can see here, he's done some time before, but then gone back to do the same type of transgressions relating to dumping waste. And the EA is hitting very hard with this. So, you know, £2.1 million, that's a big hit really on a very, very small business. So the EA is getting pretty serious, doesn't want people to be profiting from environmental crimes there. I think the other significant thing is if he doesn't come good on this, he does face quite a lengthy custodial sentence of 7 years. So hopefully that is the deterrent, and hopefully the EA will move forward with these kind of proportionate measures in place. Just to give you some stats on other actions that the EA has been doing, the number of attendance to pollution incidents is down. If we look at the equivalent periods there, comparing April to August with 2019 and 2020, what we're finding is it's only about 1/6 of incidents has actually been attended. It would be naive to think that only 1/6 of transgressions have actually taken place. I doubt that. That's a bit worrying. Also, with the Brexit, is some sense that the EA wanted to change the criteria for assessing how good our rivers are, and that doesn't run as well as it would have done under the EU descriptions. So we're a little bit worried that the state of our rivers will be less good than when we were in the EU. Again, we'll follow that up and see what that looks like as time moves on. Let's move to some more practical things here. We've got the streamlined energy and carbon reporting to be concerned about. Hopefully you all had a go at the poll now, and if there's time, we'll have a look at your responses. If you are finishing your financial report in December and you are a large entity, you will need to do your first SECR report. We can all see on screen there the criteria for doing that, and I've just popped on there a couple of little images. If you don't know what to do, please follow those links afterwards, watch the video, shows you what it is and shows you how to do it. Don't avoid doing it. It does go in your annual report and accounts, and even though we don't know what the fines are right now, the Conduct Committee of Financial Reporting is looking after that, so don't get caught out with that. Phase outs to be aware of. If you're moving into a new house, well, the days are numbered that you can have a regular gas boiler in there. And I, for one, was very pleased to see over the Christmas period broadcast telly ads for Valent for air source heat pumps, which I thought was excellent. Also, of course, we have developments and reductions in costs of solar PVs and batteries coming along, as well as ground source heat pumps. Lots of nice technologies to bring to bear there. During the time since we last met as well, the phase out of fossil fuel cars has been reeled into 2030. And let's remember that these are full EVs. So if you have a mild hybrid or a plug-in hybrid, those new cars will not be allowed to be sold from 2030. So it is the full EVs. So you may want to be saving up for your Tesla or other full EV over that time. Refrigerants to look out for are 404A is now banned. You can use reclaimed refrigerant, or you might be looking for some alternative blends with much lower global warming potential. There are a lot of choices out there, so just be aware of that. I'm hoping that's not too negative on things going out there. I've just got this one shot here, and giving a little plug there for images courtesy of Reuters, Netflix and BBC for things that have been in the news just over the past few days that we've been into 2021. Lots of positives out there, and a lovely article on Jane Goodall in The Observer on Sunday about climate change and living in harmony with our biodiversity there. Veganuary has seen 500,000 people sign up for it already, so that's a fantastic response and hopefully shows the way and the direction that people want to move in 2021. I'm going to whiz past this now, but to show you there is a link, a page of links there for you to follow up as your homework following this session. And that brings us to the end of the update. We are just a little bit short of time, so I'm going to move now quite quickly on to our first invited speaker. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, so I should be full screen. Okay, there might be someone else with a screen on there. I am delighted to introduce Professor Ian Williams from the University of Southampton to provide the overview about climate change and target setting. Ian, over to you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I'm just slowly sharing my screen, and I hope that Wendy can confirm that you can all see it.
That looks perfect. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Well, for those of you who've never come across me before, I work in the Faculty of Engineering and Physical Sciences as an Associate Dean Enterprise, but I have been an environmental scientist for, well, 33 years as a professional environmental scientist. So a long time. My interest in environmental science and business crosses over because as part of my job, I run 7 companies. The University of Southampton is unusual in that we do have a number of small and medium-sized companies that we operate, ranging from one that's largely NHS funded, which does cochlear implants. We're the only university in the country that actually runs the cochlear implantation service rather than the NHS, down to companies, very small companies, sort of 4 or 5 people who do all kinds of bespoke engineering work. And clearly we're very clued into understanding the importance of a science base when looking at climate change targets, not just for business, but for our own university. And in October, we launched our new sustainability strategy with some very serious targets to help us improve our own environmental performance. So we are trying to kind of live what we research. You'll be familiar with the background to this situation, of course, that climate change continues its relentless march. And even though we've been in the middle of a global pandemic and we've been in lockdown and people haven't been traveling, the year 2020 is still likely to be one of the 3 warmest years on record. I can't confirm that because the data are not all in yet, and we won't actually know until probably early March, but pretty certain it's going to be one of the 3 warmest years on record. And of course, the most recent decade, it will definitely be the warmest decade on record, and the warmest 6 years since records began have all happened in the last 6 years, perhaps something unsurprisingly. So despite the lockdown, atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases have continued to rise, and this might surprise many of you, but as Wendy said at the beginning, we've all been in our own properties, we've all been using our own systems, and I think the phrase she used were, I can't remember, leaky, I think was the equivalent. So we've seen the average global temperature 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. By the time we get to 2024, it's highly likely that we're going to see this exceeding the 1.5 degrees C by 2024 or so on. And at the moment, we've got La Nina, not El Nino going on at the moment. And as a result, we should be having a cooling effect on the global temperatures. So we may even be seeing the temperature being artificially lower. And this is the most recent data from the World Meteorological Organization and the Met Office. And you can clearly see the upward trend is continuing regardless of the global pandemic. Now, this is a fascinating little chart, which I hope you can see quite nicely. It's showing emissions and concentrations from 1980 to the current day, with concentrations shown on the y-axis and emissions shown at the bottom in the bar that's going up and down. And you can see the El Nino Southern Oscillation being shown as well as the ENSO. And what you can clearly see from this graph is that emissions have relentlessly gone up in the last 40 years. And this has had a direct impact on atmospheric concentrations, which have gone up by 100 ppm nearly in just 40 years. And what you can see from the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is going up and down there, is that even in the years in which we have El Nino not operating, that the emissions are not going down, and the temperatures are not going down, and the global CO2 emission concentrations are not going down. So it's a relentless march upwards, which we are not addressing simply because we're not addressing emissions, as I think Wendy correctly highlighted at the beginning. And the measures to address emissions need to come in play extremely quickly, because otherwise we are going to see the things that we've started to see happening, and you'll be familiar with all of these impacts from climate change, so I won't go through them all. We'll start to see them happening much more frequently. Certainly this winter, we've barely had any frost. We've barely had any snow in the United Kingdom. It's not been that cold until very recently. And these are real concerning consequences of climate change. Of course, there are still people who are climate deniers. One of them has just left the White House. But the consistency with which the academic community and others are highlighting that, human-generated global warming is here to stay, and we need to deal with the consequences, is robust and consistent. And again, just to pick up on Wendy's point about homes and heating, if we are going to just address homes and decarbonisation of homes, 21% of a household's carbon footprint is home heating. There are 30 million homes, and we've got 30 years to decarbonise, which means that we just need to do 1 million every year. Now, can you imagine how much effort that's going to take to do it? We've got 365 days in a year, assuming that we work every single day. Normally, there are 220 working days in a year. So you can just work out how many homes need to decarbonise every single day of every single year for the next 30 years. And that only addresses 21% of a household's carbon footprint. We haven't got onto businesses and industry yet. And all of this is in the background of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And remember, there are 17 of these, and climate action is just one of the 17 targets. Although, of course, climate action does, as you can see by the arrows, connect very clearly with multiple of the other SDGs. So they are all interconnected in some way. But I suppose I'm highlighting, again, I suppose, picking up on what Wendy was saying about water pollution, that this is just one important activity that we need to be considering amongst many urgent things. So what can businesses do? You would expect me as a scientist to argue that you need to set a science-based target. I think there's well-established series of steps now on what you should be doing. First of all, you need to commit to doing it. You need to work out what your target should be in line with the science-based criteria. You need your target to be validated, really, because we're all very poor at being both poachers and gamekeepers. So you probably need to have somebody else to check and make sure that you're doing it yourself. And also, if you don't have scientific expertise, you will need some, which is where, of course, organizations such as Carbon Footprint are so helpful, because they can do this for you. It's good practice. I would argue it's probably essential in the modern world to announce your target, keep your stakeholders informed that your business is going to be sustainable and aiming to be decarbonized, maybe carbon neutral soon. Disclose your progress. And of course, if you're making good progress, that's quite a nice thing to be able to do. If you're not making good progress, well, that's a bit embarrassing, but and it may mean that your competitors steal a march on you, which is, of course, not what you want. And it's crucial to conduct an annual review and to make the necessary amendments. And of course, this will happen naturally anyway. So, for example, your vehicle fleet is going to have to alter, again, as Wendy highlighted. You know, you're not going to be able to use gas boilers in your business in future, and so on. So in terms of how you do this using the science evidence base, I thoroughly recommend that you use international, widely used standards, and the ones I think that are excellent because they're freely available are those that have arisen from the World Resources Institute work, and these are the greenhouse gas protocol documents that you can see on the screen. Both of these are available for free. You can download them, and they both come with carbon accounting tools that you can use as well. Although I have to say that if you're not familiar with doing this, you probably are better off, well, I guarantee you are better off using a professional organization to help you to do this. But this is an illustration of the sort of thing you can do. And these protocols quite clearly are targeted at businesses. So there's a protocol on the left-hand side, which gives you an overarching free standard that you can use. If you want to go further than most people normally do, which is to just to have scope 1 and scope 2 included in your approach, there is an additional document which looks at scope 3 on the right-hand side. And what I'm going to tell you next about how you might go about this from a science-based point of view is using these two documents or similar standards as your Bibles to work from. So I've got a 21-point approach to using the Sciencebased to set your targets for businesses, divided into different activities. And the first activity is clearly to work out what your emissions inventory is and what your target should be. So you can see I've numbered the different activities that you should be doing. First of all, identify your scopes. As a minimum, you should be doing scope 1 and scope 2. If you don't know what scopes or tiers are, by the way, I have got a research paper I wrote about a decade ago which explains this very basically, and I'm happy to share that with you via Wendy. You then look at your significance thresholds, and so of course for a business, well, for even for a professional carbon footprinting company, calculating every single emissions is very difficult. So there's usually an exclusion allowed to take into account the fact that spending a huge amount of time trying to identify a very small amount of emissions is not significant in terms of the big picture. So recommendation, you can exclude up to about 5% of your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. You should be targeting all 7 of the Kyoto Protocol greenhouse gases. You need to take into account bioenergy. So these are direct CO2 emissions from the combustion of biofuels and biomass feedstocks, plus the associated carbon which might have been sequestered. Some people will kind of suggest that what they've got in this case is neutrality. If that's true, and I'm not always convinced it is, you really do need to explain what your underlying assumptions are. And then, of course, there are many companies that are just not standalone. They have subsidiaries, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense for each individual subsidiary of a company to be reporting. So, my suggestion would be to go for your parent company or a group level, not at a subsidiary level. In terms of your time frame, you need a base year and you need target years. I think going much beyond a range of 5 to 15 years is not sensible. And of course, some companies might attempt to try and cheat a bit because they might have achieved a bit of progress quite quickly and then not be aiming to do much progress in the next couple of years. So things you've already achieved from your starting point are not acceptable. You're just cheating the system if you do that. In terms of your ambition, as I've said, you should be aiming for a minimum of scope 1 and scope 2. And the targets must be consistent with the decarbonisation you need to keep the global temperature increase to below 2 degrees C, and if you're really ambitious, 1.5 degrees C of pre-industrial temperatures. Now, of course, the targets that you set can be intensity targets or absolute reductions. So again, those of you unfamiliar with the terminology, a greenhouse gas intensity target is set because it links emissions reductions relative to, say, productivity or economic output. So this might be, for example, tons of carbon dioxide per millions of euros of GDP, or millions of dollars or millions of pounds of GDP, for example. So there's an association between carbon and your actual activity. So that's what the intensity target is. Whereas an absolute emission, of course, targets specifically a reduction measured in metric tons, which is relative to a standard historical baseline. You need, of course, to make sure that the method you use is valid, and I've suggested that you use an international standard. I've given you some examples, and they already use tools. And if you choose to employ a professional organization to do this, just make sure that they're using the latest versions and an approved method and tool as well. You can combine your scope targets, but again, they have got to be in line with the decarbonisation required to keep the global temperatures to well below 2 degrees C, or preferably 1.5. I know John Buckley, who's on this call, and I are pretty of one mind. I think that things such as avoided emissions and offsets you really shouldn't be counting, because emissions are emissions, as I think I tried to highlight in my original little graphic. So just not avoiding them isn't helping particularly. You've actually got to address emissions for us to have an impact on climate change. So looking at scope 2, scope 2, of course, we need to be thinking about, in particular, some of our grid emissions. And you can use a location or a market-based approach to calculate your emissions and to track your performance against a target. You need to use a consistent approach. So if you're using a location-based approach for your base year emissions, you need to use a location approach to track your performance against target. And sorry, I've realized I'm probably going into terminology again here. So a location-based method reflects the average emissions intensity of the grid in which the energy consumption occurs. So maybe Basingstoke or Southampton or Hampshire or the UK, depending on the grid you're looking at. And these use kind of grid average emission factor data rather than something very specific for your own organization. Whereas a market-based method reflects emissions from companies that you've deliberately chosen. So if you have deliberately chosen a green electricity company, then you might deliberately pick the market-based method as opposed to the grid-based method. Renewable energy, important obviously to consider targets that actively source renewable energy. In terms of scope 3, now not every organization might wish to go for a scope 3 activity, but it's important to carry out a screening activity to see how significant the scope 3 emissions are to your company. And you can then use that to decide whether you should go with a scope 3 target or not, although I think everybody should ultimately be aiming for this. It may not be for you immediately if you're just dipping your toe in the water. And of course, your boundaries need to be in line with the boundary recommendations in the standards. You should be reporting frequently and publicly, and I would say that you probably need to do this at least every year, probably on your website or in your annual report. And again, Wendy highlighted the need for this earlier on. You might need to periodically check and recalculate, and I would suggest the minimum to be doing this is every 5 years, although of course if the standards change, and they often do because new scientific information is constantly becoming available. So for example, the intensity for the carbon intensity for methane has altered very significantly in the last 20 years, and because as more evidence has become available, we've realized it's more and more damaging. So that's my kind of 21-point step to use science-based target setting criteria based on established and kind of authoritative international standards. In terms of the longer term, for the whole of businesses, organizations, society, I've spoken many times before on the sort of things that are needed. We've got to build resilient and sustainable infrastructure. We have to reinvent urban environments to make them more livable for people as we become more and more crowded in our cities. And just make them healthier for people and to enable sustainable lifestyles. And we're starting to see some of that happening in many places now, particularly in places like Amsterdam and Madrid and so on. We've got to find effective and efficient ways to feed and fuel cities, and there's ongoing work on that. We have a lot more to be done. We've got to find ways to meet the economic challenge associated with this transition. Again, Wendy flagged that up right at the beginning. And we desperately need leadership. We desperately need cooperation, and we desperately need everybody to get on board with this. I said at the beginning, I've been an environmental scientist for professional environmental scientist for 33 years, but we still only have about 1 in 5 of the population really grasping this and trying to do something about it. Although again, as Wendy said at the head of this, things are changing and changing quickly. And I would argue that it's largely not because of people like me, it's because of the young people in the world like Greta Thunberg.
Just
so
a couple of minutes,
there we go.
I think
Over to you. Hope that's been helpful.
Ian, thank you so much for your excellent presentation, and I think building as well on the presentation that you did as well back in 2019. So thank you so much for that. It's now my pleasure to welcome back Joel Fernandez from Carbon Footprint to get all practical with setting targets. Joel, over to you, please.
Hello, and welcome to my presentation on practical climate change target setting for your business. My name is Joel, and I am an environmental consultant and engineer for Carbon Footprint. And I hope that out of this presentation, you're better informed about the way your emissions change over time, and you come out wanting to set goals for your business. So you calculate your emissions every year, but what happens next? We will tell you to offset your emissions, and that's because you've already done them and you should account for them because of that. But what do you do after that? Because offsetting is more of a plan B. You don't really want to have to be doing that. It costs money, and it's a result of emissions that you shouldn't really have caused. So the only way to avoid emissions in the future is to reduce. There are two ways you can do this. The first is you can do nothing. This sounds counterintuitive, but what you're about to find out is that doing nothing actually does cause emissions reductions because of changes that are happening elsewhere. And the other option is you can actively reduce your emissions. So this is making efforts to lower your emissions. Okay, so here's one I made earlier. I've looked at a construction company and what their emissions are like. So as you can see, they've got quite a bit of travel here, a small amount of site electricity, but it's important to note that the emissions here are all written in per £1 million turnover. The reason for this is that when you go into the future and you're looking back, assessing your emissions every year, you can then compare against where you were when you set the targets. This is a important thing to do, because obviously in the future, if your company is 10 times bigger in terms of turnover, and you're comparing it to now when it's a lot smaller, your gross emissions will look a lot bigger than they are now. But in reality, per £1 million turnover, they're probably about the same. Okay, so what happens if we do nothing? So passive reductions account for the emissions factors forecasted into the future. So this graph uses the past 5 years of DEFRA or BEIS emissions factors. That's what we use to calculate your footprints. As you can see, emissions drop fairly slowly over time. This also accounts for the legislation on fuel burning vehicles. So I think Boris Johnson's most recent thing was 2035, which is when they will stop selling new fuel burning vehicles. So you'll have to start switching to battery electrics. So this accounts for things like that. It also accounts for the decarbonisation of the grid. So over time, they're building more wind turbines, they're building nuclear power stations, and so your emissions due to electricity will slowly decrease because of that. I've also said switching to a green tariff here, so that's just so that you can see the market-based emissions as well as the location-based emissions. So this just takes out the electricity that you're using. Okay, so if we don't do anything, well, keep doing as we are. In theory, we should drop about 2/3 of the emissions of this construction company. It's important to note that it's not the same for every business, because everyone has a different footprint. So what if we do something? If we do something, then we'll aim to drop our emissions a bit faster. So here, what I've accounted for is holding site energy audits. So you might hold one of these and then decide, okay, what if we turn on our heating half an hour later, turn it off half an hour earlier? We'll make quite a lot of emission savings over time, as we'll save hours and hours per year of heating our building, perhaps unnecessarily. This will also account for switching to electric vehicles a bit faster. So why wait until 2035 when you can start doing it now? If you lease vehicles, then this is a fairly easy process to do. If you've got a grey fleet or you're using cash opt-out schemes, then there's things you can do, like installing electric charging points in your car park, because this takes away the things which are discouraging people from making the switch. There's also things like changing your flights to economy class. It's fairly easy changes that you can make to policies that will allow reductions. And finally, what you'd think is the thing causing a reduction, so trying to reduce your energy use and slightly reducing your distance traveled per year in cars. So you might say, I want everyone to try to reduce their car emissions by switching 5% of their travel each year to rail travel and gradually phasing out the car, hopefully. So as you can see, for location-based emissions, the active line drops to just under half the tons of CO2e per million by 2040, using this scenario. You've got to bear in mind that as this is per £1 million turnover, if you have a turnover of £50 million, then you're actually saving over 100 tons here, which is not something that goes unmissed. And then you've also got to bear in mind that if you're on a renewable tariff, your emissions drop very, very low as well. So if you're setting a target using this, you probably want to go between these two lines. So if you've done science-based targets as well, then you can plot where the science-based target will go in here. Hopefully it'll be below the red line. If it's not, then you're going to find it very easy to meet your science-based target, and you should probably go more towards your active goals here. Okay, so what does this look like as a breakdown? So the predicting the future is only as good as the simulation. So I accept that this isn't a perfect thing. It's fairly ambitious. So this is your active location-based simulation here. So over time, as you can kind of see, the fuel burning emissions from things like cars will gradually turn towards electric emissions. And then as the grid is decarbonized, these emissions will gradually tend towards zero. So what you're doing here is, well, what you can see here is that the way to reduce your emissions is actually to try and avoid burning fuels and gradually switch to electricity, as this will basically piggyback onto the passive emissions or the passive reductions and that will count as an active reduction. There are things here which can also be reduced but haven't been taken into account in this simulation yet. I'm still working on this. It's an ongoing process. So things like refrigerants, you might choose to pick a better global warming potential, which could make a reduction here. So once you've done your target setting, that's not the end. You should be reviewing your targets each year. If you're progressing faster than your targets, then you might want to set better targets, so further down ones. If you're going too slowly, then you should look into that and find out why that's the case, and perhaps set some more realistic targets for yourself. But obviously, if you're beating your targets, you want to shout about it, because it makes your business look very good when you're doing something for the planet and you're beating targets.
Just a couple of minutes, please, Joel.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so Ian talked about the science-based targets. So these are more high-level goals. You're looking at trying to keep global warming below the 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels. I would suggest that you need to combine this with target setting, this kind of target setting, because things like the passive reductions aren't really fully accounted for in science-based targets, though there's no point setting the target if it's not really going to meet the criteria of what's needed in the world. So you kind of need to combine these two things a little bit for a kind of bottom-up and top-down approach. So overall, what we've discussed here is that you should be setting goals for your business tailored to your footprint. So obviously, if someone else has set I'm going to reduce by 2/3 goal, you can't just say, oh well, we're going to do that too. You've got to look at if that's actually feasible. You should find out where the most cost-effective emission savings can be made. So if you can make a large amount of reductions for very little cost, obviously you're going to want to do that first. So you should do that. And yeah, take advantage of the passive reductions by you actively reducing things by switching to battery electric vehicles, for instance. This will piggyback onto the decarbonisation of electricity grids and such. You want to review your footprint and targets annually as well. Finally, I said get ahead of the legislation here. We don't currently have legislation on target setting or reduction legislation. However, this might come into place in the future. We've got SECR at the moment, so the governments have already said we need to start assessing our emissions if we're big enough. So yeah, get ahead of the legislation. Anyway, here's my sources for further reading, and I hope you enjoyed that presentation, and I will pass you back to Wendy now.
Joel, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. We're a little short of time, but I will make a comment on this, that it is very refreshing to see a practical approach to target setting. I think I've seen too much in the past of people arbitrarily setting the 2%, 5% per annum and not really understanding where it's coming from. So thank you for making that very real and focused. We move on then. We're just a few minutes behind, but I am absolutely delighted to welcome back Sharon Ball from Portals for our case study today. Sharon, over to you, please.
Hello, good morning. Stick with me. I appreciate we are running a few minutes behind, but I hope very much that we can catch up and I can keep you entertained in the next few minutes or so. That said, let's hope my mouse works and everything changes on slides. Go for it. Go on, you know you want to. Okay, so Portals, welcome back to me. I don't know if many of you recall that we discussed the same sort of topic in 2019 in October. I'm giving you now kind of an update on where we are, and so much has changed, hasn't it, everyone, since October 2019. I will mention in a moment, just as a reminder for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, who we are, Portals. And we'll be discussing really our energy needs as a paper maker and the main goals and some of the reasoning behind the goals that we have chosen to go for. We are repeating some of the stuff that we've heard earlier on with the excellent presentations we had, but I hope very much that that is a good thing. So us, over to Mill. So we're a banknote paper maker. Here we are in Hampshire. We have a smaller mill in Barford. The two of us are an independent paper business. We're entirely dedicated to providing the best banknote paper to our customers being governments and central banks, and security printers across the world. Now, for us, who are we really? So we are we hold our ethics in high esteem. We have essential quality, environment, health and safety standards that we operate to, and PSCs. So the chain of custody with forestry sustainability is important to us, where we make paper from wood-based products. Notably, I'm going to mention that we don't have a standard for an energy management, so we don't actually have ISO 50001. My personal opinion about that is that if we don't have the badge, that it suggests that as a business, and as other businesses might well see, that suggests we're not taking this seriously enough to understand and appreciate that we need a system of managing the 21 steps, or managing the carbon footprint, whichever way we do it. If we don't appreciate the systematic approach can yield such benefits, then we'll miss out. And I think, to be perfectly honest, Portals is missing out. So let's go straight to it. What are our climate change goals? We've got really five-step plan here. We're tracking and acting on any opportunity that arises to change to green gases and alternative to grid electrical inputs. So for us, if you're not familiar with the mill, we are quite an energy intensive mill. We require heat primarily to dry the banknote paper we're making. We operate a combined heat and powerhouse, so we do generate some electricity, not enough. The balance of electricity and heat needs are such that around 2/3 of what we require in electricity we self-generate. The 1/3 we still have to import. And we're operating the CHP not to optimize the CHP, but actually to optimize the heat we need for the mill. We do have a program of short and long-term improvements in energy efficiency. We have found that our science-based KPI for carbon footprint is based on what we can actually challenge ourselves to do. So we didn't glibly just go for the 2%, the 1%. We do give purchasing preference to energy efficient equipment. In a sense, this is like you buy cheap, you buy twice. So if we need to make any changes, we will prefer and aim to go for the high efficiency equipment rather than the lower stuff. We actively bar people from purchasing certain things. It was great when we had the enhanced capital allowances scheme, because we had a lovely list that told us what was better energy efficiency. Hey ho. We have a program of replacement of inefficient equipment, so it's a good thing that we're looking for energy efficient equipment in the first place, but we don't just wait until it's broken before we fix it. We do have an ongoing program of replacement of equipment. And as a backstop, whilst we're trying to do what we can to mitigate the effect of the greenhouse gases that we're emitting, we still have to also consider adaptation. We've had other discussions on that. For us, that really means flood risks. Anyway, for us, I have to say, it's going to show my age that I'm sort of Kermit the Frog. Anyway, so it really isn't, I would say, easy being green, and I was still looking out for those climate change heroes. We do need climate change heroes in any industry, and particularly within the paper industry. So I've opened a few questions. It's imperative that we do globally cap that carbon dioxide. I've mentioned carbon dioxide, but greenhouse gas emissions. However, how do we know that the goals we set will have material influence? This is an open question, really. What I mean to say by that is we don't want to greenwash ourselves. You don't want to appear to be making some changes, but not knowing whether they are helpful or useful. So I'm going to leave that question open for people to think about. What I'd also like to mention is, can we in any way influence others not to undo the work we're doing? Equally, can we influence our suppliers? Can we influence our customers? There is a still open question, should we in the UK and other countries where there is regulation, regulate for carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, so that those emissions don't go unregulated elsewhere. Ultimately, though, and particularly within the paper sector that runs on machinery that's only just being run in if it's 30 years old, we do need innovation and change. We need some heroes like Bonnie Tyler. I'm holding out for a hero here. Where are we national progress wise? This actually very similar to a chart you've already seen. We have carbon budgets. It appears to me, by this chart that we're actually overachieving, and yet the blue line of Wendy's chart suggested that we might well soon be flatlining, and there is a risk here about the 4th and 5th carbon footprint that we carbon budget, sorry, that we may not meet. That's where we all have to start digging deep, isn't it, to start thinking about how we can make some changes. And the cost of reaching net zero, these slides, by the way, are courtesy of the Confederation of Paper Industries. I'm drawing your attention also to the fact that the estimates are between 50 billion and 70 billion pounds per year, but those rise to over $1 trillion by 2050. This harks back to an earlier discussion about whether it's worth waiting. Why wait to make some changes, make the changes soonest? Because I think one of the points not necessarily mentioned here is the benefit can be so much greater if we make changes sooner, and certainly less costly sooner. And there's success in decarbonising in the electricity sector, but that comes at some huge cost. That cost has to be borne by somebody. And for the paper sector, customers don't always want to be willing to pay more for their product. They will be more willing to go elsewhere. And for the UK-based industry, what is the substitute for gas at the moment? The economic case for gas is so incredibly strong that policy, legislation, nothing is pushing us away from gas hard enough or fast enough to take us out of gas-fired CHP. And there are alternatives out there, but they are far more expensive. And so we are still looking for that innovation. On that matter, there is funding available within this particular sector to support the businesses, but we're not talking billions of funding. We're talking a few millions of funding, which I find personally quite disappointing. And there is no support for gas-fired CHP conversions into biomass, which is very disappointing. On those two quite negative points, there are still businesses I'm really heartened to see who are actively trying to engage and trying to build for the future in the race to get us to that net zero point in 2050. And again, we've mentioned the United Nations Climate Change Conference in 2021. I'd like to mention it also again here. This sounds incredibly riveting, and I think a lot of businesses can do what they must to contribute to getting us towards zero materially, using whichever mechanisms you have. And there are a couple of hashtags here that might be worth taking a look at, because wherever we are able to contribute and to advertise that point and to shout it, then that is going to perhaps influence more so the customers, the neighbours, the public, into maybe having some higher expectations of us. And that may not be such a bad thing after all. So I'm very riveted and very interested in what will happen within the climate change conference. I'd like to just finish here. I appreciate I have whizzed through my slides somewhat. However, I hope that at least you've seen that for us as a business, we have many pressures because of such a energy intensity, but we understand that for any sorts of business, we do need to consider more strongly the future, that we all need to survive in it. If we wish to make paper within that future, we need to be part of the solution. We need to find those innovations so that we can continue to operate within the future. On that concluding note, I'm going to stop presenting to you, but thank you very much for all of your time.
Sharon, thank you so much for your fascinating presentation there, and also for putting us back on schedule there with time. What I will say is that these sessions only take place because of the sponsorship provided by the three councils that are listed there on screen of Basingstoke-and-Deane, Hart and Rushmore, and we thank them for making these sessions possible. I'm hoping from today that you're taking away the imperative to start setting some realistic climate change targets within your own business. I'm hoping as well that you've seen some practical means to actually give some targets away from arbitrary numbers, and from Sharon Ball's presentation, what you get when you actually do that. So please.
Thanks so much for watching the session. We do hold these regularly, and if there are particular topics you'd like us to cover or you would like to present at these sessions, please do contact us at carbonfootprint.com and we would love to hear from you.